"Effective immediately. You're being terminated for breach of confidentiality," Marcus declared coldly, sliding a manila folder across the polished conference table. 12 years at Elysium Capital Partners, and this was my goodbye. A sterile meeting room with 2 security personnel hovering by the door, like vultures waiting for their next meal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Nora Chen, 38 years old, senior financial analyst, at what used to be a respected investment firm before the new executive team took over 3 years ago. I dedicated over a decade to maintaining the integrity of our financial records, ensuring every transaction was legitimate and properly documented. Now I was being escorted out like a criminal. The termination letter outlines the confidentiality clauses you violated, Marcus continued, his steel-grey suit as impeccable as ever, not a single silver hair out of place. As CFO, I can't have team members who undermine our corporate protocols. Security will accompany you to collect personal belongings. I maintained my composure, meeting his gaze steadily without betraying the storm of emotions beneath my calm exterior. No tears, no pleading. That's exactly what he expected. Instead, I placed my company badge on the table with deliberate care. "I understand," I replied simply. Marcus looked momentarily disappointed by my measured response. He'd clearly anticipated a scene that would justify the security presence. I stood up, smoothed my charcoal pencil skirt, and picked up my leather portfolio, the same one my mentor had given me when I'd earned my CPA license. Inside was a flash drive containing meticulously documented evidence of the $5, $2 million, in accounting discrepancies I'd uncovered over the past 7 months. The walk to my office was excruciating. Colleagues glanced up, then quickly away, suddenly fascinated by their monitors. Only my assistant, Erin, had the courage to meet my eyes, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. I gave her a subtle nod that I hoped conveyed everything I couldn't say aloud. Security Officer Rodriguez looked uncomfortable as he followed me. "For what it's worth, Miss Chen, I think this is wrong," he whispered, as I carefully wrapped my daughter's handmade clay pencil holder in tissue paper. "Thank you, Rodriguez. Not your fault." I methodically packed my few personal items, leaving behind the numerous industry awards I'd earned for the company. Those belonged to the real Elysium Capital, the one I'd joined 12 years ago, not this hollow shell it had become. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been expecting this day for weeks. Ever since I'd documented the first suspicious administrative adjustment that conveniently balanced the books for our largest client, Helix Pharmaceuticals. The adjustments had grown bolder, and my questions to the accounting team had been repeatedly deflected or ignored. When I'd finally taken my concerns directly to Marcus 3 weeks ago, his response had been immediate. A reassignment to smaller clients and restricted access to the Helix accounts. I placed my company phone on the desk, but kept my portfolio close. Inside that leather case wasn't just evidence of manipulated financial statements, but proof of a systematic effort to inflate Helix's quarterly earnings ahead of their IPO, complete with emails, transaction logs, and the original unadjusted records I'd been careful to preserve. The elevator ride down 27 floors felt interminable. Rodriguez maintained a respectful silence as we descended. The security guard at reception, an older man named Walter, who'd always greeted me with a warm smile, couldn't meet my eyes as he collected my access card. The bright September sunshine felt jarring as I stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. Just like that, 12 years reduced to a cardboard box and a termination letter citing corporate policy violations. I walked steadily to the parking garage, placed my meager belongings in the trunk of my Volvo, and slid into the driver's seat. Only then, in the privacy of my car, did I allow myself a moment, not of despair, but of resolve. I opened my portfolio and ran my fingers over the flash drive containing everything Marcus believed was gone. I hadn't always been this cautious, this suspicious of my own workplace. The first 8 years at Elysium had been challenging, but fulfilling. I joined when the firm was led by Richard Elysium himself, a financial industry veteran who'd built his company on principles of rigor and integrity. "The numbers don't just tell us what's happening, Nora," Richard had told me during my first year. "They tell us who we are. Our job is to make sure they tell the truth." I'd taken those words to heart, building my reputation on thoroughness and ethical practice. When Richard retired, his son Michael sold the controlling interest to Vertex Financial Group. The changes came gradually at first: new performance metrics, streamlined reporting procedures, different approval thresholds that reduced oversight. On certain transactions, nothing that would raise immediate alarm bells. Then Marcus Reynolds arrived from Vertex as the new CFO, bringing with him a team of financial efficiency specialists and ambitious growth targets. Within 6 months, 3 senior financial controllers had been replaced with Marcus's former colleagues. By the 1-year mark, our client portfolio had expanded by 30%. With Helix Pharmaceuticals becoming our premier account, I drove home in a daze, the familiar route barely registering as my mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. As I pulled into the driveway of my craftsman-style house, reality began to sink in. For the first time in 12 years, I had nowhere to be tomorrow. No quarterly reports to review, no financial models to build, no irregularities to quietly investigate. My house felt unnervingly quiet as I set the cardboard box on my kitchen counter. I poured myself a glass of the Cabernet I'd been saving for special occasions, though this wasn't the celebration I'd envisioned. The irony wasn't lost on me, being fired for breach of confidentiality, when in reality, I'd been too dedicated to the company's true values. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. My brother, David. "Nora, what the hell? Tom from compliance just texted me that you were escorted out. What happened?" The concern in his voice was evident, even through his attempt at professional distance. David worked in Elysium's legal department, a connection that had made my discoveries all the more complicated. I gave him the sanitized version, terminated for alleged confidentiality breaches. They claim I accessed files beyond my authorization. "That's ridiculous," he said immediately. "You're the most by-the-book person I know. This has to be wrongful termination. We need to fight this." "No," I said firmly. "No lawsuits, David." "But Nora, trust me on this." I took a slow sip of wine. "Some battles aren't fought in courtrooms." There was a long pause. "This is about those discrepancies you mentioned, isn't it?" he finally asked, his voice lowered, despite being on his own phone. "The Helix account?" "David, I can't discuss this with you. You work for Elysium's legal team. I don't want to put you in an impossible position." Another pause. "I understand. But as your brother, not as legal counsel, are you okay?" "I will be," I assured him, more confident than I felt. "Just be careful there, okay?" After we hung up, I went to my home office and connected the flash drive to my personal laptop. The files were organized chronologically, 7 months of discrepancies, each one meticulously documented with before and after snapshots of the financial records. The pattern was clear: accounting adjustments that consistently inflated Helix's revenue projections while minimizing their R&D expenditures, creating a falsely optimistic picture for potential investors ahead of their upcoming IPO. This wasn't just creative accounting or generous interpretation of financial principles. This was deliberate securities fraud, with Elysium Capital as a knowing accomplice. The $2 million in irregularities I'd identified were likely just the surface of a much deeper deception. I opened a new document and began typing, not an angry letter or resignation, just a clear, factual summary of what I'd discovered. Dates, amounts, specific transactions, and the pattern of manipulation that emerged when viewed collectively. I included screenshots of the most egregious examples, with annotations explaining the significance of each adjustment. The email addresses for the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower office waited in the recipient field. My cursor hovered over the send button. Was I really prepared to do this? This wasn't a small internal matter that could be resolved with a corrective memo. This was fraud that could affect thousands of investors. People at Elysium, including possibly my own brother, could lose their jobs. The company Richard Elysium had built on principles of integrity could collapse entirely. I closed the laptop without sending anything. Instead, I found myself drawn to the framed photo on my bookshelf. My graduation from business school, with my parents beaming proudly on either side of me. My father, a small-town accountant, who'd taught me that numbers were the universal language of truth. Do right by the numbers, he always said, and you do right by the people they represent. What would you do, Dad? I whispered to his image. I knew the answer. My father never compromised on ethics, even when it cost him clients or caused uncomfortable confrontations. The moment you let the small deceptions slide, he'd warned me, you open the door to bigger ones. I slept poorly. That night, my dreams fragmented with images of spreadsheets where the numbers kept shifting, refusing to add up no matter how I tried to balance them. By morning, something had crystallized within me, a clarity of purpose that cut through the fog of shock and uncertainty. This wasn't about my job anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about the integrity of the financial system I'd dedicated my career to upholding. It was about the investors who would make decisions based on fraudulent information. It was about what happened when watchdogs became accomplices. I made coffee, dressed professionally out of 12 years of habit, and picked up my phone. The contact was still there, though I hadn't called the number in years. Professor Winters, it's Nora Chen from your Advanced Accounting Ethics seminar at Berkeley. Nora, what a pleasant surprise. It's been, 15 years? Almost. I need some advice if you have time. It's about a complex financial ethics situation. Those are my favorite kind, she replied warmly. Can you meet me for lunch? Diana Winters had been more than just my professor. She'd been my mentor during my graduate studies and had gone on to serve as a commissioner with the SEC before returning to academia. If anyone could help me navigate these treacherous waters, it was her. 3 hours later, I sat across from Diana at a quiet cafe 2 towns away from Elysium's headquarters. Her silver-streaked hair was shorter than I remembered, but her penetrating gaze was unchanged, the same look that had intimidated and inspired a classroom full of aspiring financial professionals. So, they fired you for finding irregularities, she summarized after I'd outlined the situation, careful to avoid naming Elysium or Helix specifically. Classic case of killing the messenger. They claim it was for confidentiality breaches, accessing files outside my authorization. And did you? Her direct question carried no judgment. Technically, yes. After my access to the Helix accounts was restricted, I used my administrative privileges to continue monitoring the adjustments. I knew something was wrong, and I needed to document it. Diana nodded thoughtfully. So they have a procedural case, even if the moral high ground is clearly yours. She stirred her tea. What do you want to happen here, Nora? The question caught me off guard. I want the truth to come out. I want the people responsible to be held accountable. All of them, including your brother's colleagues, including the company your mentor built. I hesitated. Yes, all of them. The company my mentor built wouldn't want to be protected if it meant perpetuating fraud. And what about your career? Financial analysis is a small world. Whistleblowers often find themselves blacklisted, regardless of how justified their actions were. I know the risks, I said quietly, but I can't unknow what I know, and I can't pretend I didn't see what I saw. Diana studied me for a long moment, then reached into her bag and produced a business card. Camila Rodriguez, Enforcement Division, SEC, tell her I sent you, and that I vouched for your credibility. She placed the card on the table between us. But Nora, be prepared. Once you start this process, you can't control where it ends. That evening, I received an email from Elysium's HR department. The severance agreement required my signature on a non-disclosure clause that would prevent me from discussing any aspect of company operations, specifically including client financial matters. The compensation offered was insultingly low, 3 months' salary for 12 years of service. I forwarded the document to Leslie Park, an attorney friend who specialized in employment law. Her response came within the hour. They're scared, Nora. This goes way beyond standard separation agreements. The language is extraordinarily restrictive, and the penalties for violation are draconian. What exactly did you find over there? What happens if I don't sign? They're threatening to withhold your accrued vacation payout and contest unemployment benefits. It's legally questionable, but they're betting you can't afford protracted litigation. I thanked her and promised to consider my options carefully. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already made an appointment with Camila Rodriguez at the SEC for the following morning. Just after dinner, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera and was startled to see Marcus Reynolds on my porch, his usual corporate armor replaced by casual attire that seemed calculated to appear non-threatening. "Nora," he said warmly when I opened the door, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee, rather than a CFO who'd fired me hours earlier. "May I come in? I wanted to personally check how you're doing." I hesitated, then stepped aside. Better to hear what he had to say, to understand what I was truly dealing with. I led him to my living room, but didn't offer refreshments. "The severance package," he said, placing a fresh copy on my coffee table. "There was a miscalculation. We can offer an additional 2 months if you sign today." "What's the rush?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The board is finalizing next quarter's budget. We need to close out all pending obligations, like accurately reporting Helix's R&D expenditures." The words slipped out before I could stop them. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise quickly masked by calculated concern. "I'm not sure what you mean." "The Q3 adjustments," I said carefully, "the ones that reclassified $1.8 million in research costs as administrative overhead. Accounting treatments are complex, Nora. You know that. Sometimes there are legitimate reasons for reclassification. And the deferred revenue that mysteriously became current in the same quarter, the one that magically aligned with Helix's projection targets right before their investor roadshow." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's smile vanished completely. "I'd be careful with accusations, Nora, especially unfounded ones that could be construed as defamatory." His voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "Did you remove any company documents when you left? Because that would constitute theft of proprietary information." "I kept copies of my work product as permitted in the Employee Handbook Section 8.3. I replied truthfully, grateful for my meticulous reading of company policies. He stood abruptly. "I'll give you until tomorrow to reconsider the severance offer. After that, things might become complicated for your professional future." After he left, I checked my email to find a message from an anonymous sender. "Back off if you know what's good for you. We know about the flash drive." That night, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked across from my house. It was still there when I left for my SEC meeting the following morning, though it made no attempt to follow me, a strange detail that was somehow more unsettling than direct surveillance. Camila Rodriguez was younger than I'd expected, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a rapid-fire questioning style that tested the precision of my documentation. For 3 hours, we went through my evidence item by item. She neither confirmed nor denied the significance of what I'd brought, maintaining professional neutrality, even as she requested additional details on specific transactions. "Your documentation is thorough," she finally acknowledged, "but corporations, like Elysium, have armies of lawyers who will argue these are isolated accounting judgments rather than systematic fraud. We need more to build a compelling case." "What kind of more?" "Communications showing intent, internal discussions about the adjustments, evidence that management knew these changes misrepresented the financial reality." She hesitated. "Ideally, someone still on the inside who can corroborate your findings." I left the SEC offices with mixed emotions. They were interested, but my evidence alone wasn't enough to guarantee action. And involving anyone still at Elysium would put their career, and possibly more, at risk. When I returned home, my email inbox was flooded with password reset notifications for accounts I'd never created. My LinkedIn profile had been flagged for suspicious activity and temporarily suspended. A quick check of my credit report showed multiple hard inquiries from lenders I'd never contacted. The message was clear. They could make my life difficult in ways that would never be traced back to them. They could damage my credit, undermine my professional reputation, and create endless administrative headaches, all while maintaining plausible deniability. I called Professor Winters again. "They're pushing back," I told her. "Hard." "Expected," she replied calmly, "but concerning. It suggests there's much more at stake than what you've already uncovered. Forward me everything, the severance offer, the anonymous message, the credit inquiries. Document the surveillance. This pattern of intimidation is significant in itself." "What about my evidence?" Camila said they need more. Her pause told me everything. "She's right, Nora. What you have is compelling, but these cases are extraordinarily difficult to prove without clear evidence of intent or someone on the inside. Keep thinking about who might help." I hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. They were watching me, pressuring me, and I didn't have enough ammunition to fight back effectively. Not yet, anyway. A week after Marcus's visit, I received a text from Erin, my former assistant. "Can we meet? Not at your place. Somewhere public but private. Important." We arranged to meet at the university library, 2 towns over, public enough to be safe, private enough for conversation, and unlikely to contain anyone from Elysium's social circles. Erin arrived looking exhausted, constantly scanning the room as she approached my table in the back corner of the reference section. "They're doing an internal audit," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not a real audit, Nora. They're altering historical records, backdating approvals, creating documentation that never existed before, changing classification codes on hundreds of transactions." "How do you know this?" "They brought in consultants from Vertex, but they're using the regular system. They don't realize I can see the metadata changes. Every document in the system keeps a modification history, even if the content itself is restricted." She pulled out a flash drive. "I've been tracking everything, the original records and what they've been changed to." I stared at the tiny device, understanding immediately what it represented. "You're risking your job, Erin." "They're already planning to eliminate my position once the audit is complete." Her laugh was bitter. "Found that out when I was asked to draft the restructuring memo for my own department." What Erin showed me went far beyond what I'd initially discovered. This wasn't just about making Helix's financial position look more favorable than it was. Elysium had been systematically manipulating financial reports for multiple clients, creating phantom revenue streams, reclassifying expenses to improve profit margins, and in some cases, creating completely fictional transactions to balance accounts that would otherwise raise red flags. "There's more," Erin said, pulling up an email chain she'd forwarded to her personal account. "They're planning to sell the wealth management division to a private equity group. The clients won't know until it's finalized." "And the client trust accounts?" Her expression confirmed my worst fears. "They've been borrowing from them for nearly a year. If the sale goes through quickly enough, the new owners will be left holding the bag when the discrepancies come to light. Millions of dollars in client funds, retirement accounts, college savings, all at risk because of executive greed and financial manipulation. Who else knows about this? Just the executive team and their inner circle. And now you." She hesitated. "And maybe someone else." "Jason from the audit committee started asking questions last month about the Helix account. He disappeared 2 days before you did." "Fired?" "That's the thing. There's no termination record. His employee file shows he resigned for personal reasons, but his desk was cleared out overnight, and no one's heard from him since." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Have you tried to contact him?" "His company email was deactivated. Immediately, his personal phone goes straight to voicemail." "No." On the drive home, I couldn't shake the sense that we were dealing with something darker than financial fraud. The surveillance car was gone from my street when I returned, but somehow that didn't reassure me. I tried Jason's number. Straight to voicemail, as Erin had said. I left a vague message about connecting regarding professional opportunities. Then I called Camila Rodriguez again. "We need to move faster," I told her, explaining what Erin had shared. "They're actively destroying evidence and potentially putting client funds at risk." "This changes things," she agreed. "The client trust account angle elevates this significantly. I'll speak with the enforcement team today. But Nora," she paused, "be careful. If they're manipulating records on this scale, they're desperate. Desperate people make dangerous choices." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jason, about Richard Elysium, who'd built his company on principles of integrity, about the clients who trusted Elysium with their financial futures. At 2 a.m., my security system alerted me to movement in my backyard. By the time I reached the window, whoever it was had vanished, but my home office window was damaged, just slightly, but enough to notice. They weren't just watching anymore, they were sending another message. Nowhere was safe. I didn't wait for them to make another move. By dawn, I was executing a plan I'd been formulating since Erin's revelations. First, I moved all my evidence, both my documentation and Erin's, to 3 separate secure locations. One set went to my parents in another state, with instructions to give it to a specific attorney if anything happened to me. Another went to a cloud server, accessible only with a complex encryption key that I memorized rather than wrote down. The third I delivered personally to Camila Rodriguez with additional notes explaining the connections between seemingly unrelated transactions. Next, I reached out to Sarah Jenkins, a former colleague who'd left Elysium 6 months before me after raising concerns about client account management. We met at a diner 40 miles from the city. "I've been expecting this call," she said grimly after I explained the situation. "I found similar discrepancies in the client trust accounts, started documenting them. Next thing I know, I'm being called into HR for performance issues that had never been mentioned before." "Did they threaten you afterward?" "Not directly. But someone broke into my car 2 weeks later. Nothing valuable taken, just my work notebook and laptop. Police called it opportunistic theft, but it felt targeted." She leaned forward. I filed reports, insurance claims, documented everything. Never thought it would be useful, but it establishes a pattern, doesn't it? Would you be willing to speak with SEC investigators? She nodded without hesitation. Been feeling guilty for staying quiet this long. By afternoon, I'd connected with 2 more former employees with similar experiences. Each had pieces of the puzzle, departments where numbers didn't reconcile, client complaints that disappeared from tracking systems, compliance concerns that were buried rather than addressed. Camilla called with news. The Enforcement Division is officially opening an investigation, but we need more about those client trust accounts. Without current records showing the actual state of those accounts, Elysium's lawyers will claim any issues were discovered and corrected internally. Erin was already taking an enormous risk just talking to me. Asking her to extract more documents might put her in real danger. That's when my phone rang, an unknown number with a Chicago area code. Nora. The voice was barely recognizable. It's Jason. I stepped outside the coffee shop where I'd been working, instinctively scanning the street. Jason, where are you? Are you okay? Listen carefully. His words were rushed, frightened. The Veritas Fund prospectus. Check the asset holdings against the actual trading records. They've been reporting phantom assets to maintain their management. Or fee structure. It's at least $12 million in fraud, maybe more. Jason, where are you? They threatened my family. Said they'd make sure my kids never got into college, that my wife would lose her medical license. His voice broke. I'm leaving the country, but someone needs to stop them before more people lose everything. The line went dead. Institutional investment fraud, client trust account borrowing, and now phantom assets in managed funds. This wasn't just about cooking the books anymore. It was about systematic theft disguised as financial management. I called Camilla immediately, relaying Jason's information. Her response was immediate. This changes everything. I'm bringing in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Can you come to our office now? 3 hours later, I sat in a conference room with Camilla and 2 FBI agents. I laid out everything, the accounting manipulations, the document alterations, the client trust account irregularities, and now the managed fund fraud. We'll need your full cooperation, one agent said. This investigation will become very visible very quickly. I understand your safety might be compromised. We can arrange protection. I shook my head. I have a better idea. The next morning, I called Marcus directly. I've been thinking about that severance package, I said, keeping my voice submissive, defeated. I'd like to discuss terms. Wise decision, he replied, poorly concealing his satisfaction. Come to the office tomorrow, 9 a.m. We'll finalize everything. Actually, I countered, I'd prefer somewhere more neutral. The Bayview Hotel. They have private meeting rooms. He hesitated, then agreed. What he didn't know, the Bayview was already being prepared by federal agents, rooms wired, for recording, and every entrance under surveillance. The trap was set, and Marcus was walking right into it. The Bayview Hotel's orchid room felt unnaturally quiet as Marcus reviewed the paperwork I'd brought. His attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Vanessa, sat beside him, occasionally whispering in his ear. This all looks in order, he finally said, sliding the non-disclosure agreement across the table. Just sign here, and we can put this unfortunate situation behind us. I looked at the document, 14 pages of legal language designed to silence me forever. Beside it sat the severance check, 5 months' salary for 12 years of service. Before I sign, I said carefully, I'd like to clarify something. This agreement covers all company matters, correct? Including the client trust account irregularities and the Veritas Fund discrepancies. The attorney stiffened. Marcus's smile faltered for just a moment. All company matters, he confirmed smoothly. Standard language. I nodded, reached for a pen, then paused. One more question. Does this cover my obligation to report federal securities laws, violations I've witnessed? What are you implying? Vanessa leaned forward, her voice razor-sharp. I'm not implying anything. I stood slowly. I'm stating that I've already provided evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations to federal authorities, including our conversation right now. On cue, the conference room door opened. Camilla walked in, flanked by FBI agents. Marcus Reynolds, one agent said, we have a warrant to search all Elysium Capital Partners facilities and seize financial records related to client accounts and managed funds. His face drained of color as Camilla placed a thick folder on the table. This is just a fraction of what we have, she said quietly. The rest is being presented to a grand jury as we speak. Marcus lunged for his phone, but an agent gently intercepted him. The CEO and other executives are being questioned simultaneously, he explained, along with several of your colleagues from Vertex Financial. I didn't stay to watch them lead Marcus away. My part was done. 6 months after the arrests at the Bayview Hotel, I stood in the renovated offices of what was now called Elysium Trust Advisors. The computers hummed with the same rhythm they had for years, but everything else had changed. The company had been placed in receivership during the investigation. When the dust settled, a coalition of senior advisors had purchased the wealth management division with backing from a venture capital firm committed to ethical financial practices. They'd renamed it Elysium Trust Advisors. They'd asked me to help establish new compliance systems, transparent ones, with checks and balances built into every level. All set for the day, Ms. Chen? Rodriguez, now head of security, nodded respectfully as I signed in at the reception desk. Just about, I replied, returning his visitor badge. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same man who'd escorted me out in disgrace now welcomed me as a respected consultant. Outside, David waited in his car. How's it looking in there? He asked as I settled into the passenger seat. Good. They've got a solid team. They'll be fine without me checking their math. I glanced back at the building. Richard would be proud. David had resigned from Elysium's legal department the day after my firing, unwilling to remain at a company that had treated his sister so unjustly. The decision had spared him from being caught in the subsequent investigation, though he'd voluntarily provided information about the legal department's role in approving problematic transactions. We drove in comfortable silence for a while. The news had covered the Elysium case extensively. Executives arrested, charges filed, plea bargains negotiated. Most client funds had been recovered. Not everything, but enough that most investors wouldn't suffer catastrophic losses. Marcus and several other executives were awaiting trial. The CEO had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced charges. Any regrets? David asked as we pulled up to my new office building. I thought about the question carefully. No, I finally answered. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because it was right. That evening, I packed away my files on Elysium. The whole story was documented, preserved, but I no longer needed to carry it with me. Tomorrow, I was starting as a financial compliance consultant for an industry association, helping other firms establish systems that made it harder for the next Marcus Reynolds to manipulate accounts and betray client trust. Not a bad second act for a 38-year-old analyst who just wanted the numbers to tell the truth. But while that chapter was closing, the deeper story was just beginning. The investigation into Elysium had opened a Pandora's box of interconnected financial improprieties that stretched far beyond one investment firm. My phone rang just as I was pouring a celebratory glass of wine. Camilla Rodriguez, from the SEC. Nora, do you have a minute? There's something you should know. I settled onto my couch, notepad ready. What's happening? The trail from Elysium led us to 3 other firms with similar patterns of fraud. all connected through Vertex Financial Group. Her voice was tight with controlled excitement. This is bigger than we initially thought. Much bigger. How much bigger? We're looking at potentially $300 million in fraudulent transactions. Across multiple institutions, a coordinated effort to manipulate markets, defraud investors, and evade regulatory oversight. My hand froze around my wineglass. And you're telling me this because we need your help. Your expertise in spotting these particular patterns is unmatched. We'd like to bring you on as a special consultant to the investigation. You mean join the SEC? Temporarily, yes, as a special advisor to the Enforcement Division. 6 months, possibly longer. I sat back, mind racing. This wasn't what I'd planned. My consulting business was just getting off the ground, built on the surprisingly positive reputation I'd developed as the Elysium whistleblower. Taking on a government role would mean putting that on hold, stepping back into the shadows of a complex investigation. Can I think about it? Of course, but not too long. This is moving quickly. After hanging up, I walked to my home office and stared at the freshly packed Elysium files. I'd thought this part of my journey was complete, that I could move forward, taking the lessons learned and applying them in a controlled, predictable way. But perhaps that was too comfortable, too safe. Perhaps my experience had prepared me for something larger, a chance to address systemic problems rather than individual symptoms. I called David, outlined Camilla's proposal in carefully general terms. You've already done your part, Nora, he reminded me. You don't owe them anything more. I know, but this isn't about obligation, it's about opportunity, a chance to make a bigger difference. He was quiet for a moment. You know what Dad would say. I smiled, picturing our father's thoughtful expression. He'd say that when you have the chance to fix something that's broken, you take it. Exactly. But he'd also remind you to take care of yourself in the process. That night I dreamed of spreadsheets again, but this time, instead of shifting numbers that refused to balance, I saw clear patterns emerging from the chaos, threads connecting disparate figures into a coherent picture. I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt since before my termination from Elysium. I called Camilla first thing in the morning. I'm in. When do we start? 2 weeks later, I found myself in a secure conference room at the SEC's regional office, surrounded by financial analysts, enforcement attorneys, and forensic accountants. The walls were covered with diagrams mapping the connections between companies, executives, and transactions. Nora, can you walk us through what you're seeing in the Helix pharmaceutical account patterns? Camilla asked, handing me control of the presentation. I stood, surveying the room of professionals. 6 months ago, I'd been an isolated whistleblower, doubting my own judgment in the face of institutional pressure. Now, I was being asked to lead the analysis of what was shaping up to be one of the largest financial fraud investigations of the decade. The key to understanding this pattern is recognizing that it's designed to hide in plain sight. I began, pulling up the first set of transaction records. These aren't crude manipulations that obviously violate accounting principles. They're sophisticated adjustments that exploit the gray areas of regulatory guidance. For the next hour, I walked them through the methodology I'd developed for identifying the subtle signs of manipulation, timing patterns between adjustments, consistent rounding tendencies, repeating delta values that suggested algorithm-driven alterations rather than human judgment. Impressive work, noted Senior Enforcement Attorney Jackson when I finished. How did you first spot these patterns at Elysium? I considered the question carefully. It wasn't one big red flag. It was an accumulation of small inconsistencies. That didn't make sense in isolation, but formed a pattern when viewed together. I started tracking them initially out of professional curiosity. Something just felt off about how certain clients' accounts were being handled differently. Intuition backed by methodology, Camilla summarized. "That's exactly why we need you on this investigation." The work was intense and consuming. Days stretched into evenings as we followed financial trails through a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and complex transaction structures designed to obscure their true nature. Vertex Financial Group, we discovered, had systematically installed executives like Marcus at multiple firms, creating an interconnected network of financial manipulation that operated just below the regulatory radar. 3 weeks into the investigation, I received an unexpected visitor at my temporary SEC office. Richard Elysium himself, now in his 70s but still carrying himself with the dignified bearing I remembered, stood at my door. "Ms. Chen, may I have a moment of your time?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk, surprised and slightly apprehensive. I hadn't spoken to Richard since his retirement party 4 years earlier. "I've been briefed on what you uncovered," he said without preamble. "I wanted to thank you personally. The company I built was being used as a vehicle for fraud, and you were the only one with the courage to stop it." "I was just doing my job," I replied, uncomfortable with his gratitude. "The job you taught your employees to do." Nevertheless, it couldn't have been easy. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, studied me carefully. "I understand you lost friends, risked your reputation, even faced threats." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Having my actions validated by the man whose principles had guided my career meant more than I'd expected. "I'm establishing a foundation," he continued, "focused on ethics in financial services, education, certification, advocacy for stronger protections. I'd like you to consider joining the board when your work here is complete." The offer caught me completely off guard. I'd be honored to discuss it." "Good." He stood, extending his hand. "What you did matters, Ms. Chen, not just for my former company, but for the entire industry. Remember that on the difficult days." After Richard left, I sat motionless, processing the unexpected encounter. His recognition had shifted something inside me, transforming what had been a painful, isolating experience into a meaningful contribution to a field I still believed in, despite its flaws. The investigation continued to expand. Each new discovery branched into additional areas requiring scrutiny. What had initially appeared to be financial fraud, focused on inflating company valuations, had grown to encompass market manipulation, pension fund misappropriation, and securities fraud that potentially impacted thousands of investors. 4 months in, we hit our first major breakthrough. A junior analyst named Miguel identified a pattern in trading activities across multiple Vertex-connected firms that demonstrated clear coordination, systematic manipulation designed to artificially inflate certain securities while shorting others. "This isn't opportunistic fraud," Camilla declared during our strategy meeting. "This is a calculated scheme designed from the beginning to exploit regulatory gaps and investor trust. And we now have enough evidence to move on the primary architects." Within 2 weeks, coordinated raids were conducted at offices across 3 states. Dozens of executives were brought in for questioning, including Victor Zhao, the reclusive founder of Vertex Financial Group, who had masterminded the entire operation. The financial media exploded with coverage. "SEC uncovers massive financial fraud network," screamed the headlines. My name wasn't publicly connected to the investigation, a protection Camilla had insisted upon given the scale of the operation and potential for retaliation. But within industry circles, the connection to the Elysium case was obvious. Late one evening, as I was preparing a detailed analysis for the prosecutors, Camilla stopped by my office. "How are you holding up?" she asked, perching on the edge of my desk. "Tired, but good." I stretched, realizing I'd been hunched over my computer for hours. It feels like we're finally making real progress. We are. She studied me thoughtfully. You know, when you first came to us with the Elysium evidence, I wasn't sure if you were just a disgruntled ex-employee with a grudge or the real deal. I've never been happier to be proven wrong. I laughed. To be fair, I was both disgruntled and right. The best combination. She smiled, then grew serious. The director has asked me to create a permanent financial forensics unit within enforcement. Specialized team focused on identifying these complex fraud patterns before they reach this scale. He's authorized me to build my own team. I saw where this was heading. Camilla, just consider it, Nora. You have a gift for this work. A way of seeing connections that others miss, plus the courage to follow them wherever they lead. That's rare. I had a consulting business planned, helping companies strengthen their internal controls. Noble work, she acknowledged. But reactive. With us, you'd be on the front lines, stopping these schemes before they damage innocent investors. I promised to think about it, though in truth the idea had already taken root. The past 4 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of my career. Complex problems that demanded my full intellectual capacity, work that had clear purpose and impact, colleagues who valued rigorous analysis and ethical standards. As the case against Vertex and its network moved toward prosecution, my temporary role at the SEC neared its end. The decision about what came next loomed larger. I arranged dinner with David, hoping my analytically minded brother could help me sort through my options. "So, let me get this straight," he said as we settled into a quiet corner table at our favorite restaurant. "You can either launch your own consulting firm, likely very successful given your new reputation, or join the SEC permanently to chase down financial criminals." "That's about the size of it," I confirmed, sipping my water. "Both have their advantages." "And which way are you leaning?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure. The consulting path offers independence, probably better compensation, more control over my schedule. But the SEC work feels more consequential, like I'd be addressing root causes rather than symptoms." David studied me carefully. "You know, when we were kids, you always organized the neighborhood cleanups. Remember those? Instead of just picking up trash in our yard, you'd create maps and schedules, get all the other kids involved. Mum used to say you couldn't stand to see problems partially solved." I smiled at the memory. I was an intensely annoying child, or someone who understood instinctively that systemic problems require systemic solutions. He leaned forward. "Nora, the consulting work would be valuable. You'd help individual companies improve. But from what you've told me about this investigation, there are fundamental issues in how our financial systems are regulated and monitored. Who better to address those than someone who's seen the manipulation from the inside?" His perspective clarified what I'd been feeling, but couldn't articulate. The consultant path was safer, more conventional. The SEC role was where I could make the greatest difference. 2 days later, I sat in Camilla's office, having made my decision. "I have conditions," I stated after accepting her offer. She raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "I want to maintain a connection to the industry, speaking engagements, training, seminars for financial professionals. Prevention is as important as enforcement, and I want resources to develop better detection algorithms for identifying manipulation patterns." That can be arranged. Anything else?" "I want to help establish whistleblower protection protocols that actually work. The current system leaves people too vulnerable during the critical early stages of reporting." She smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. The director has already approved a task force on exactly that issue. He wants you to lead it." 1 year to the day after my termination from Elysium Capital Partners, I walked into the SEC regional office with a new title, Deputy Director of the Financial Forensics Unit. My team of analysts was small but growing, already making significant progress in developing new methodologies for detecting coordinated financial fraud. The Vertex case had resulted in multiple convictions, including 20-year sentences for Victor Zhao and 3 other executives who had orchestrated the scheme. Marcus Reynolds had accepted a plea deal in exchange for cooperation, receiving a reduced sentence of 8 years. More importantly, regulatory reforms were being implemented based on the vulnerabilities our investigation had exposed. That evening, I received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden box containing a fountain pen. The accompanying note was handwritten on heavy stationery. Numbers don't lie. People do. Your job is to make sure our numbers tell the truth. Thank you for remembering. Richard Elysium. I placed the pen carefully on my desk, a tangible reminder of the principles that had guided my journey from fired whistleblower to financial fraud investigator. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led exactly where I needed to be, a place where my particular skills and experiences could help create a financial system more resistant to corruption and manipulation. Sometimes the most significant contributions come not from following established paths, but from having the courage to challenge them. My father's voice echoed in my mind. Do right by the numbers, and you do right by the people they represent. 1 year later, I was doing exactly that, on a scale I could never have imagined when I first noticed those suspicious administrative adjustments in the Helix accounts. The fight for financial integrity would never be completely won. But with each case, each new detection methodology, each regulatory improvement, we were making it harder for the next Marcus Reynolds or Victor Zhao to succeed. That, I had come to believe, was a life's work worth pursuing. As I locked my office that evening, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. No longer the isolated whistleblower fighting a lonely battle, but a financial defender with the authority, resources, and team to effect real change. The journey had transformed not just my career, but my understanding of what was possible when principles were backed by persistence and courage. The numbers would always tell the truth. My job was to make sure people listened. The financial forensics unit quickly established itself as a formidable presence in the regulatory landscape. Within 18 months, we had developed sophisticated detection algorithms that could identify potential fraud patterns across seemingly unrelated transactions, flagging concerns before they ballooned into systemic issues. Our conference room wall displayed a growing map of interconnected financial entities under investigation, a visual representation of the complex webs we were untangling. Each red string connecting different institutions represented potential coordinated manipulation. Each blue pin marked a confirmed case of fraud we'd uncovered. The Collins Investment Group case is ready for referral to prosecutors, I announced during our weekly strategy meeting. The evidence of market manipulation is comprehensive and compelling. Miguel, the junior analyst who'd made the breakthrough on the Vertex case and had since become one of our most valuable team members, nodded in satisfaction. 3 months from initial flag to prosecution ready. That's a new record for us. This was the new normal. Proactive identification rather than reactive investigation. We weren't waiting for whistleblowers like my former self to risk everything. By coming forward, we were spotting the red flags early and moving decisively. After the meeting, Camilla pulled me aside. The director wants to see you. Something about a special assignment. An hour later, I sat in Director Warren's office, reviewing the file he'd placed before me. Titanium Financial Services, he said, watching my reaction carefully. One of the largest wealth management firms in the country. 3 trillion in assets under management. Impeccable reputation. Until now, I observed, scanning the preliminary analysis. These capital reserve discrepancies are concerning. They're more than concerning. They suggest titanium might be significantly over-leveraged while presenting a picture of rock-solid stability to clients and regulators alike. He leaned forward. This isn't just another case, Nora. Titanium is considered too big to fail. If they're engaging in the kind of manipulation our initial data suggests, the potential market impact would be catastrophic. I understood the gravity immediately. The Vertex case, for all its complexity, had involved firms that could collapse without threatening the broader financial system. Titanium was different, deeply integrated into pension funds, municipal investments, and international markets. Why bring this to me specifically? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Because Titanium's CEO is Jonathan Maxwell. The name hit me like a physical blow. Jonathan Maxwell had been Marcus Reynolds' mentor at Vertex before becoming Titanium's chief executive 5 years ago. The connection was too significant to be coincidental. You think the Vertex fraud methodology has been implemented at Titanium? On a much larger scale. Director Warren nodded grimly. And given Maxwell's history of retaliating against anyone who questions his methods, we need someone who knows exactly what to look for and has the courage to pursue it, regardless of the pushback. That's you. I'll need a specialized team. People I trust completely, with diverse expertise. You'll have whatever resources you require. This investigation needs to be airtight from day one. I left the director's office with the weight of what he was asking settling on my shoulders. Investigating Titanium wouldn't just be challenging from a technical perspective. It would be politically charged, potentially dangerous, and would certainly attract powerful opposition. That evening, I called Richard Elysium. Our relationship had evolved from former employer-employee to something closer to mentorship as I joined the board of his Financial Ethics Foundation. Titanium, he said when I outlined the situation in carefully general terms. That's not just climbing a mountain, Nora. That's Everest. I know. That's why I'm calling. What am I not seeing? What should I be preparing for that isn't in the case files? His sigh traveled through the phone. Jonathan Maxwell has cultivated extraordinary political connections. Board members at regulatory agencies, former classmates in federal court appointments, substantial donations to both political parties. A pause, and he plays hardball, the kind that makes what happened to you at Elysium look like a friendly disagreement. You sound like you're warning me away from this. Quite the opposite. I'm telling you to go in with your eyes fully open. Maxwell believes himself untouchable, which makes him both dangerous and vulnerable. Arrogance leaves blind spots. I contemplated this wisdom. Any specific advice? Document everything. Trust no one outside your core team. And watch for the misdirection. Maxwell's specialty is creating distractions while the real action happens elsewhere. Over the next week, I assembled a specialized team for the Titanium investigation. Miguel for his data pattern recognition skills, Camilla for her prosecutorial expertise, Zhang Wei, a forensic accountant who'd previously worked at a Titanium competitor and understood their business model intimately, and surprisingly, my brother David, who had pivoted his legal career toward financial regulation after the Elysium case and now worked for the Treasury Department. Isn't this a conflict of interest? David asked when I approached him. Given our history with Marcus Reynolds and the Vertex connection. Actually, it's the opposite. We need people who recognize the patterns. Just make sure everything is documented with exceptional thoroughness. This case will face extraordinary scrutiny. We established a secure investigation room separate from our main offices, a precaution against both digital surveillance and internal leaks. The walls quickly filled with transaction maps, organizational charts, and timeline sequences as we built our understanding of Titanium's operations. 3 weeks in, Wei made our first significant breakthrough. They're using a double ledger system, he explained, pulling up parallel financial statements. The regulatory filings show capital reserves meeting all requirements, but their internal risk management system tells a different story. Reserves that cover barely 60% of their exposure. How did you get access to their internal systems? Camilla asked, concern evident in her voice. Evidence obtained improperly could compromise the entire case. I didn't, Wei smiled. They outsourced their risk management software to quantum analytics. I worked with the same system at my previous firm. The reports Titanium generates for regulatory compliance and the ones they use internally have different parameters, but they draw from the same data lake. I simply identified the disparities in how that data is filtered and presented. It was elegant, legal, and damning. Titanium was presenting one picture to regulators and a completely different one to its own executives. This is just the beginning. I warned the team. Based on the Vertex methodology, there will be multiple layers of deception. We need to find them all before making a move. The investigation progressed methodically. Each discovered irregularity leading to deeper layers of financial manipulation. Titanium had created an elaborate structure of subsidiaries and special-purpose vehicles that obscured its true risk exposure while presenting an image of conservative management to clients and regulators alike. 2 months into our work, the first sign of trouble appeared. A financial blog published a piece questioning the SEC's witch hunt against successful financial institutions, specifically mentioning increased scrutiny of Titanium. The article named no sources, but contained details that could only have come from someone with knowledge of our investigation. "We have a leak," Camilla concluded during our emergency meeting. "Not necessarily from our team," I countered. "The details are general enough that they could have come from regular reporting channels. Titanium would know they're being looked at more closely, just not the specifics of what we've found. Nevertheless, we implemented additional security protocols and accelerated our timeline. If Titanium realized the extent of our investigation, they might begin covering their tracks more aggressively. A week later, I received a message from an unfamiliar number. Central Park, Bethesda Fountain, noon tomorrow. Come alone. Information about Titanium you need to hear. Every instinct warned me this could be a trap, yet anonymous sources were often crucial in complex financial investigations. After discussing it with Camilla, we developed a safety plan. I would meet the source, but with surveillance from our security team and a panic button app installed on my phone. The next day was unseasonably cold, the park relatively empty as I approached the fountain. A woman in her 50s sat on a bench nearby, her professional attire suggesting a financial industry background. "Ms. Chen," she acknowledged as I sat beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "Thank you for coming. You have information about Titanium." She nodded, not looking at me directly. "My name is Eleanor Davidson. I was Chief Risk Officer at Titanium until 3 months ago when I was suddenly terminated for strategic differences." The name was familiar. I'd seen it in Titanium's executive leadership history during our background research. "The real reason I was pushed out," she continued, "was because I identified significant discrepancies in our derivatives exposure reporting. When I brought my concerns to Jonathan Maxwell, he assured me they would be addressed. 2 weeks later, I was escorted from the building. "Do you have documentation?" I asked, trying to contain my excitement at this potential breakthrough. "Better." She slid a thumb drive toward me. "I have the algorithm they use to generate dual reports. One, showing our actual exposure for internal decision-making, another showing our supposedly hedged position for regulatory filings. The difference represents approximately $14 billion in unreported risk. If verified, this would be exactly the smoking gun we needed, concrete evidence of deliberate misrepresentation rather than interpretive differences in accounting practices. Why are you sharing this? You must understand the potential consequences. Her expression hardened. I dedicated 30 years to building risk management systems that protect institutions and their clients. What Titanium is doing isn't just bending rules. It's creating systemic risk that could trigger another financial crisis if their positions move against them. Someone has to stop them before that happens. Back at our secure room, the team worked through the night analyzing Davidson's evidence. By morning, we had confirmation. The algorithm did exactly what she claimed, automatically generating parallel reporting streams that allowed Titanium to maintain two fundamentally different versions of their financial reality. This is definitive, Camilla declared, reviewing our findings. With this algorithm as evidence, we can prove intent to deceive regulators. No more plausible deniability about accounting interpretations. We still need to verify the current implementation, I cautioned. Davidson left 3 months ago. They may have altered their methods since then. Wei nodded in agreement. We need to compare current regulatory filings with actual positions. That will require access we don't currently have. Not necessarily, Miguel interjected, pulling up a complex diagram. Titanium's derivatives positions have counterparties, other institutions taking the opposite side of their trades. If we can analyze the aggregate positions reported by those counterparties, we can reconstruct Titanium's actual exposure without needing direct access to their current systems. It was brilliant lateral thinking, using the financial ecosystem's interconnectedness to reveal what Titanium was trying to hide. The approach would take time, but would be virtually impossible for Titanium to detect or counter. Over the next 3 weeks, we painstakingly assembled the counterparty analysis, building a comprehensive picture of Titanium's true risk exposure. The results were more alarming than we'd anticipated. Not $14 billion in unreported risk, as Davidson had estimated, but nearly $22 billion. A market movement of just 5% against their positions could trigger a liquidity crisis that would ripple through the entire financial system. We need to move now, I urged during our briefing with Director Warren. The risk isn't just to investors, but to market stability itself. The director studied our evidence carefully. Normally, I'd agree. But we've received pressure from unexpected quarters. The Treasury Secretary called me personally yesterday, expressing concerns about potential actions against significant market participants during a sensitive economic period. The implication was clear. Powerful forces were moving to shield Titanium from scrutiny. With respect, Director, that's precisely why we can't delay, I countered. This pressure confirms that Maxwell is activating his political connections. The longer we wait, the more opportunity they have to obscure evidence or manufacture distractions. After a tense discussion, we reached a compromise. We would accelerate our preparation for enforcement action while the director managed the political dimensions. Our team would have 2 weeks to finalize our case before decisive action would be taken. Those 2 weeks became the most intense period of my career. We worked around the clock, anticipating every possible defense Titanium might mount, documenting every aspect of their deception with meticulous precision. David focused on ensuring our legal approach was unassailable, while Wei and Miguel refined the technical analysis to eliminate any ambiguity. 3 days before our deadline, a breaking news alert flashed across our screens. SEC investigator accused of vendetta against financial institutions. Past termination raises questions about motivations. The article detailed my firing from Elysium and subsequent role in the Vertex investigation, suggesting a personal grudge against the financial industry. was driving my current work. Anonymous sources questioned my objectivity and the legitimacy of investigations launched under my leadership. The attack was predictable, yet still infuriating. Maxwell was indeed playing hardball, attempting to discredit me personally to undermine our investigation. "This is actually good news," Camilla observed, surprising the team. "They're attacking you rather than our evidence. It means they can't find substantive flaws in our case." She was right, of course. The personal attack was a desperation move, suggesting our investigation had indeed uncovered the truth they were trying to hide. Still, the media scrutiny was intense and distracting. That evening, Director Warren called me to his office. "The Oversight Committee wants you to testify about these allegations before we proceed with any action against Titanium." My heart sank. This was a classic delay tactic designed to bog down our investigation in political theater, while Titanium covered its tracks. "Sir, with respect, that's exactly what Maxwell wants. Every day we delay gives Titanium more opportunity to restructure positions and obscure evidence." The director's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I understand, Nora, but we need to maintain public confidence in our process. The testimony is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Your team should continue preparing the case in your absence." I spent the night preparing, anticipating every possible attack on my credibility and motives. By morning, I was ready, not just to defend myself, but to turn the hearing into an opportunity to expose the real issues at stake. The Oversight Committee room was packed with media, financial industry representatives, and curious onlookers when I took my seat at the witness table. Senator Harrison, known for his close ties to the financial sector, opened the proceedings with barely disguised hostility. "Ms. Chen, serious concerns have been raised about your objectivity in investigations targeting financial institutions. Your personal history suggests a pattern of antagonism toward the industry. How can the public trust that your actions are based on evidence rather than personal vendetta?" I leaned toward the microphone, my voice steady. "Senator, I appreciate the opportunity to address this directly. My work is not driven by antagonism toward financial institutions, but by commitment to their integrity. The financial system functions on trust. Trust that reported numbers reflect reality, that risks are properly disclosed, that client interests are protected. When that trust is violated, it undermines the entire system that millions of Americans rely on for their financial security." For the next 3 hours, I fielded increasingly pointed questions about my methodology, motivations, and specific actions in previous cases. Throughout, I maintained professional composure while redirecting the conversation toward the principles at stake rather than personalities or politics. Senator Diaz, one of the few committee members with a background in financial regulation, eventually cut through the theater. "Ms. Chen, setting aside these allegations about your motives, if you were to summarize the actual evidence that has led to the investigation of Titanium Financial, what would you tell this committee?" This was the opening I'd been waiting for. While careful not to reveal specific details that might compromise the ongoing investigation, I methodically outlined the general patterns of regulatory evasion we'd identified across multiple institutions, explaining how sophisticated financial manipulation created risks invisible to ordinary investors, and sometimes even to regulators using traditional monitoring approaches. "These aren't technical violations of obscure regulations," I concluded. "They represent deliberate efforts to create a false picture of financial reality. One set of facts for internal decision-making, another entirely different set for regulatory compliance and public disclosure. That divergence creates the conditions for financial instability that could affect everyone in this room and millions of Americans beyond it." The hearing concluded without the clear victory Maxwell had likely hoped for. Rather than discrediting our work, the proceedings had elevated the importance of financial enforcement and highlighted the sophisticated techniques being used to evade meaningful oversight. As I left the committee room, a reporter called out, "Ms. Chen, Jonathan Maxwell has just issued a statement calling your testimony irresponsible fear-mongering and announcing a lawsuit against you personally for defamation. Your response?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. Mr. Maxwell is entitled to his opinion and legal strategies. I remain focused on the evidence, which will speak for itself when fully presented in the appropriate forum. Back at our secure room, the team had continued making progress during my absence. Wei had identified a critical pattern in Titanium's most recent filings that suggested they were indeed scrambling to reposition assets in anticipation of regulatory action. "They're unwinding their most problematic positions," he explained, "but in doing so, they're creating a documented trail of their previous deception. Each adjustment essentially confirms what we've been alleging." Director Warren joined us later that evening, his expression more resolved than I'd seen previously. "The hearing backfired on them," he stated without preamble. 3 committee members called me privately afterward, expressing support for aggressive action. The Treasury Secretary has withdrawn his concerns. We move tomorrow. The next morning, a coordinated operation began at 9 a.m. sharp. SEC enforcement. Teams arrived simultaneously at Titanium's headquarters, data centers, and key subsidiaries, armed with warrants to secure all financial records and prevent any destruction of evidence. Similar actions were launched at several counterparty institutions to ensure a complete picture of Titanium's actual positions would be preserved. I watched from the operations center as the carefully planned enforcement action unfolded. Unlike the Elysium case, where I'd been a whistleblower hoping for justice, I was now leading the response to financial misconduct with the full authority and resources of the regulatory system behind me. The financial news channels exploded with breaking coverage as word of the raid spread. Titanium stock plummeted, trading was temporarily halted, and analysts scrambled to understand the implications. By afternoon, the first details of our findings were being released to the public, carefully framed to provide transparency without causing market panic. Preliminary examination of Titanium Financial's records indicates significant discrepancies between regulatory filings and internal risk management data, read the official statement. The SEC has taken action to secure relevant evidence and ensure accurate information is available to market participants. In a parallel action that took even our team by surprise, the Federal Reserve announced temporary liquidity support measures to ensure market stability during the resolution of regulatory matters involving a significant financial institution. This decisive move prevented the market contagion that might have resulted from Titanium's interconnected positions unwinding chaotically. Jonathan Maxwell was conspicuously absent from Titanium's headquarters during the raid. Reports later confirmed. He had flown to his property in the Cayman Islands the previous evening. His hastily issued statement claimed he was cooperating fully while vigorously contesting these unwarranted actions based on fundamentally flawed analysis. As evening approached, and the initial phase of the operation concluded successfully, Director Warren gathered our core team. "This isn't the end," he cautioned. "It's the beginning of what will likely be a complex, contested process. Maxwell and Titanium will fight with everything they have, but you've built a case that can withstand that scrutiny, and you've done it the right way, methodically, ethically, by the book." He looked directly at me. "The very approach that got you fired from Elysium has now made you exceptionally effective at the SEC. Sometimes our greatest strengths emerge from our most difficult challenges." His words resonated deeply. My journey from isolated whistleblower to leader of a major financial enforcement action had indeed been forged through adversity. Each obstacle, the termination, the threats, the public attacks, had strengthened my resolve and sharpened my skills rather than defeating me. Later that night, alone in my office, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary path that had led to this moment. The terrifying uncertainty after being fired had transformed into purposeful action. The isolation of whistleblowing had evolved into leadership of a dedicated team. The personal risk of standing alone against powerful interests had become the institutional authority to hold those same interests accountable. My phone buzzed with a message from Richard Elysium. Saw the news. Remember when I said Maxwell believes himself untouchable? You just proved no one is. Well done. I smiled, appreciating his support, but knowing the real work was just beginning. Identifying financial misconduct was only the first step. Creating systems that prevented its recurrence was the ultimate goal. Each case provided new insights into how regulations could be strengthened, monitoring improved, and accountability enhanced. What had started as a personal stand for integrity at Elysium had evolved into something much larger, a commitment to financial systems that served the public interest rather than exploiting it. The $5 million in accounting irregularities that had cost me my job had led ultimately to uncovering $22 billion in hidden risk at one of the world's largest financial institutions. As I gathered my things to finally head home, I passed the wall, map in our secure room, the red strings and blue pins that represented our ongoing investigations. Each connection represented not just potential fraud, but also the opportunity to protect countless investors, pensioners, and ordinary citizens who relied on financial integrity without even realizing it. The path forward would not be easy. Maxwell and others like him would continue fighting to maintain their advantages, using every resource at their disposal. But they now faced something they hadn't anticipated: regulatory systems evolving to match the sophistication of those attempting to evade them, led by people who understood the techniques from the inside. I had once been fired for uncovering $5 million in accounting irregularities. Now I was leading investigations that protected the integrity of trillion-dollar markets. Sometimes, I reflected as I left the building, the worst days of our lives become the foundation for our greatest contributions. The key was refusing to be silenced, continuing to pursue truth even when the costs seemed too high, and transforming personal setbacks into fuel for systemic change. The summer heat shimmered above the courthouse steps as I navigated through a cluster of reporters, their questions blending into a cacophony of shouts and camera clicks. After 18 months of investigation, evidence gathering, and legal preparation, United States versus Maxwell was finally going to trial. Ms. Chen, do you expect the jury to understand the complex financial mechanisms at the heart of this case? I paused briefly at the courthouse doors. Financial fraud may employ sophisticated techniques, but its essence is simple: lying about money to gain advantage while harming others. I trust the jury completely. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The prosecution table was staffed with the Justice Department's finest financial crimes attorneys, alongside SEC experts including Camilla. I would be their key witness, the architect of the investigation that had uncovered Titanium's massive fraud. The defense side was equally impressive. A battalion of high-priced lawyers from 3 prestigious firms, their tailored suits and confident postures designed to convey unassailable authority. Jonathan Maxwell himself sat at the center, his expression a practiced mask of indignant innocence. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom. His held a cold calculation I recognized immediately, the same look Marcus Reynolds had given me in that final confrontation at Elysium. It was the stare of someone who believed that money and power would ultimately shield them from consequences. regardless of evidence. All rise! The bailiff's command brought the room to attention as Judge Rivera entered. The titanium trial had been assigned to her specifically for her background in financial regulation before joining the bench, a promising sign that technical complexities wouldn't become a smokescreen for the defense. The trial's opening days focused on establishing the fundamental facts: titanium's dual reporting systems, the massive discrepancy between their public regulatory filings and internal risk assessments, the deliberate construction of financial vehicles designed to hide rather than distribute risk. On the fourth day, I was called to testify. As I took the oath, I felt a profound sense of transformation from my first halting steps as a whistleblower to this moment, standing confident and prepared, backed by institutional authority rather than fighting against it. "Ms. Chen," began the lead prosecutor, "could you explain to the jury how your investigation into Titanium Financial began and what you discovered?" For the next 3 hours, I guided the court through the methodical process we had followed, translating complex financial mechanisms into clear, understandable terms. I explained how titanium had created a sophisticated facade of compliance while deliberately concealing enormous risks from regulators and investors alike. In essence, I concluded, displaying a simplified diagram on the courtroom screens, titanium maintained 2 sets of books, one showing their actual risk exposure, which they used for internal decision-making, another showing a fictional, heavily sanitized version of those same positions, which they presented to regulators and the public. The difference between these 2 versions represented approximately $22 billion in hidden risk exposure. During cross-examination, Maxwell's lead attorney attempted to portray our investigation as a vendetta, focusing heavily on my history with Elysium and connections to the Vertex case. "Isn't it true, Ms. Chen, that your entire career at the SEC has focused on targeting successful financial institutions after your termination from Elysium Capital?" "My career has focused on uncovering financial fraud regardless of where it occurs," I replied calmly. "The connection between these cases isn't my personal history. It's the similar methodologies employed to deceive regulators and investors. But you must admit you have personal animosity toward executives like Mr. Maxwell, given your experience at Elysium." I took a measured breath before answering. "What I have is a personal commitment to financial integrity. The same commitment that cost me my position at Elysium now guides my work at the SEC. This case isn't about personalities. It's about $22 billion in deliberately concealed risk that threatened not just Titanium's investors, but the broader market stability. As the trial progressed, Eleanor Davidson's testimony proved particularly damning. As Titanium's former chief risk officer, she provided insider confirmation of Maxwell's direct involvement in creating and maintaining the dual reporting system. "Mr. Maxwell explicitly instructed me to ensure that our internal risk assessments remained separate from our regulatory reporting workflows," she testified. "When I expressed concerns about the growing divergence between these 2 pictures of our financial position, he said, and I quote, 'Regulators only need to know what the regulations specifically require them to know.'" The defense team fought vigorously, bringing in expert witnesses who offered alternative interpretations of Titanium's financial structures, arguing that the dual reporting reflected legitimate differences in analytical approaches rather than intentional deception. On the trial's 11th day, an unexpected development rocked the proceedings. An anonymous source provided the prosecution with emails from Maxwell's personal account, discussing the explicit strategy of maintaining regulatory versions and reality versions of key financial positions. The regulatory framework is designed for last century's financial system, Maxwell had written to his inner circle. Our obligation is to our shareholders, not to outdated rules that don't comprehend modern finance. The compliance layer is just that, a layer over the actual business. The defense immediately challenged the admissibility of these emails, but their authenticity was quickly verified. More importantly, they demolished the narrative that Titanium's dual reporting systems were merely different analytical frameworks rather than deliberate deception. After 6 weeks of testimony, technical explanations, and fierce legal battles, the case went to the jury. For 3 days, they deliberated while the financial world held its breath. Titanium stock had been suspended from trading during the trial, but related financial instruments fluctuated wildly with each rumor of the jury's progress. On a crisp autumn morning, the verdict was announced. Jonathan Maxwell and 5 other Titanium executives were found guilty on multiple counts of securities fraud, filing false reports with regulatory agencies, and conspiracy to defraud investors. As the verdicts were read, I watched Maxwell's composure finally crack. The belief in his own immunity that had sustained him throughout the trial shattered visibly as the reality of accountability took hold. His face reflected not remorse but disbelief, the genuine shock of a man who had never imagined that rules would actually apply to someone of his stature. 3 weeks later, Maxwell was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The other executives received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. Titanium Financial itself entered receivership. Its legitimate operations eventually sold to competitors, while its fraudulent structures were unwound under regulatory supervision. The landmark case established powerful precedents for financial enforcement, closing several regulatory loopholes that had enabled Titanium's deception. More importantly, it sent a clear message throughout the financial industry. Sophistication was no longer a reliable shield against accountability. In the aftermath, I received a surprising invitation to address the annual Financial Industry Regulatory Conference, traditionally a gathering dominated by the very institutions we regulated. The invitation represented a significant shift in how the industry was responding to the new enforcement reality. Standing at the podium, facing hundreds of financial executives, compliance officers, and industry leaders, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't about gloating over victories or threatening future actions. It was about charting a path forward that served both financial innovation and public protection. The Titanium case wasn't ultimately about complex financial instruments or regulatory technicalities, I began. It was about a fundamental choice that faces everyone in this room daily. The choice between transparency and deception, between short-term advantage and long-term sustainability, between finance that extracts value and finance that creates it. I scanned the audience, noting the mix of defensive skepticism and genuine attention. I'm not here to suggest that regulation should stifle innovation, or that every financial practice must fit neatly into predefined categories. The financial system evolves continuously, as it should, but evolution that deliberately obscures risk or misrepresents reality isn't innovation. It's deception wearing innovation's clothes. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined a vision of collaborative regulation, one where financial institutions and regulators work together to create frameworks that accommodated genuine innovation while ensuring transparency and stability. I detailed specific examples from our financial forensics unit where we had worked with institutions to develop compliant approaches to new financial instruments, rather than simply imposing penalties after problems emerged. The choice isn't between unfettered freedom and stifling control, I concluded. It's between short-term thinking that ultimately destroys value and long-term vision that creates sustainable prosperity. The most successful institutions in this room already understand this. They compete vigorously but honestly. They innovate within ethical boundaries. They recognize that trust is their most valuable asset, and that trust requires consistent truth-telling, not selective disclosure. The response was more positive than I'd anticipated. Several industry leaders approached afterward, expressing interest in working with our unit on proactive compliance frameworks. Others shared concerns about competitors using deceptive practices, similar to Titanium's. The conversation was shifting from adversarial positioning to mutual recognition of shared interests in system integrity. As the conference concluded, I found myself in conversation with Catherine Winters, CEO of Harbour Financial Group, one of the largest and most respected firms in the industry. "That was quite a speech," she observed, studying me with shrewd assessment. "Most regulators come to these events to flex their authority or deliver warnings. You came with an invitation to collaboration." "Adversarial regulation is inherently limited," I replied. "We can't possibly match the resources or creativity of the entire industry. But we don't need to if enough leaders within the industry recognize that integrity isn't just morally right, but commercially advantageous in the long run." She nodded thoughtfully. The Titanium case was a watershed moment. Maxwell's approach, treating regulation as a game to be outmaneuvered, has been more widespread than anyone publicly admits. His conviction has prompted serious soul-searching in many boardrooms, including mine. In what way? "We've always prided ourselves on technical compliance, but your speech made me question whether that's sufficient. There's a difference between meeting the letter of regulatory requirements and fulfilling their underlying purpose of creating transparent, stable markets." This conversation echoed many others I'd had in recent months, evidence of a genuine philosophical shift accelerated by the Titanium case. Financial leaders were reassessing the sustainability of deceptive practices, recognizing that the regulatory landscape had evolved to match the sophistication of those attempting to evade it. That evening, I received a call from Director Warren. "The White House called. The President is establishing a commission on financial system reform and wants you as one of the key members." The commission would bring together regulators, industry leaders, academic experts, and consumer advocates to develop comprehensive recommendations for modernizing the financial regulatory framework, the most significant potential overhaul since the 2008 financial crisis. They specifically cited your unique perspective bridging industry experience and regulatory expertise, he added. "This is a rare opportunity to shape the system at a fundamental level." I accepted immediately, recognizing the extraordinary platform this would provide for advancing the principles I'd fought for throughout my career. From fired whistleblower to presidential commission member, a journey I could never have imagined when Marcus Reynolds had slid that termination letter across the conference table at Elysium. The Financial System Reform Commission launched with considerable fanfare 2 months later. Our mandate was sweeping. Examine every aspect of financial regulation, identify systemic vulnerabilities, and recommend structural changes to enhance both stability and innovation. Our first public hearing focused on whistleblower protections and early warning systems, a topic I approached with unique credibility given my personal history. The commission room was packed with industry representatives, media, and public observers as I introduced our panel of experts. "Financial misconduct flourishes in darkness," I began. "Effective whistleblower systems aren't just about individual courage. They're about creating institutional mechanisms that bring problems to light before they become crises. Today, we'll examine how such systems can better serve both market integrity and institutional health." The hearing featured testimony from whistleblowers across various financial sectors, including Eleanor Davidson from the titanium case. Each shared not only their experiences of identifying misconduct, but also the institutional barriers that had made reporting difficult or dangerous. "The current system places almost all risk on the individual," Eleanor testified. "Even with theoretical protections, whistleblowers face career destruction, legal harassment, and personal attacks. Meanwhile, the institutions and executives who committed the underlying misconduct often escape with minimal consequences. This asymmetry of risk and reward inevitably suppresses crucial information." As the Commission's work progressed through subsequent hearings, we developed a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory landscape's strengths and weaknesses. I pushed consistently for reforms that would enhance transparency, align incentives with system stability, and create more effective early intervention mechanisms. During a working session focused on regulatory technology, I introduced a proposal that synthesized many of the insights from my work at the Financial Forensics Unit. Our current approach relies heavily on periodic reporting reviewed by understaffed regulatory agencies, I explained to my fellow commissioners. This creates fundamental information asymmetries that sophisticated actors can exploit. Instead, we should develop secure, automated monitoring systems that provide regulators with continuous visibility into key risk indicators while protecting legitimate proprietary information. The proposal generated intense debate. Industry representatives on the Commission worried about overreach, while consumer advocates questioned whether technological solutions would be consistently implemented. "What you're suggesting is a significant paradigm shift," noted Commissioner Abernathy, a respected financial scholar. "From periodic disclosure to continuous transparency, from retrospective enforcement to real-time monitoring. The technical and governance challenges are substantial." "They are," I acknowledged, "but so are the costs of maintaining our current reactive posture." The titanium fraud continued for years before detection, creating $22 billion in hidden risk. Each day of delay increased the potential damage to investors and market stability. A properly designed monitoring system could have identified the divergence between their regulatory and internal risk assessments within weeks, not years. Over the following months, this concept of continuous transparency became a central theme in the Commission's work. We developed detailed technical specifications, governance frameworks, and implementation roadmaps for a new regulatory approach that would leverage technology to close the information gaps that enabled sophisticated fraud. Throughout this process, I often thought of my former self, the isolated analyst at Elysium who had spotted accounting irregularities but lacked the institutional support to address them effectively. Each recommendation we developed was designed to empower future versions of that analyst, creating systems where integrity was structurally reinforced rather than individually burdensome. After 18 months of hearings, research, and deliberation, the Commission presented its final report to the President in a Rose Garden ceremony. The comprehensive document included over 200 specific recommendations across regulatory structure, enforcement mechanisms, technological implementation, and market design. This report represents a new vision for financial regulation, the President stated as cameras flashed. Not as an adversarial constraint on markets, but as the essential infrastructure that enables markets to function with integrity and stability. I'm particularly grateful to Commissioner Chen, whose unique journey from industry whistleblower to regulatory leader has informed many of the most innovative recommendations. As I stood with my fellow commissioners for the official photographs, I caught sight of Richard Elysium among the invited guests. His presence was a poignant reminder of how far I'd come from that devastating day of termination, and how that apparent ending had actually been the beginning of something far more significant. After the ceremony, Richard approached with a warm smile. From finding $5 million in accounting irregularities to redesigning the national financial regulatory framework. Quite a journey, Nora. One I never could have predicted, I admitted. When Marcus fired me, I thought my professional life was over. I never imagined it was actually just beginning. He nodded thoughtfully. The strongest structures are often built on the sites of previous collapse. You've turned personal adversity into systemic improvement. That's a rare achievement. Implementation of the Commission's recommendations began almost immediately with bipartisan legislation, incorporating many of our core proposals. The Continuous Market Integrity Act established the technological and regulatory framework for real-time monitoring of key financial risk indicators, while the Enhanced Whistleblower Protection Act significantly strengthened safeguards for those who reported misconduct. 2 years after the Commission concluded its work, I received another unexpected call from Director Warren, now approaching retirement. "The President is nominating you to become the next SEC chair," he informed me, obvious satisfaction in his voice. "The official announcement comes tomorrow, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." The nomination represented an extraordinary opportunity to implement the vision I'd helped develop through the Commission, and an extraordinary validation of the path I'd traveled. From fired analyst to the nation's top financial regulator was a journey of transformation I could never have imagined. The Senate confirmation hearings were rigorous but largely supportive. My experience on both sides of the regulatory relationship, as industry professional and enforcement leader, was widely viewed as valuable perspective for the challenging role. "Ms. Chen," one senator observed during the final hearing, "your career embodies a core American principle that individuals with integrity can stand up to powerful interests and ultimately transform systems for the better. What lesson do you hope your journey sends to professionals throughout the financial industry?" I considered the question carefully. That integrity isn't just a personal virtue. It's a practical necessity for sustainable finance. The individuals and institutions that view ethics as a constraint to be minimized eventually discover that trust is actually their most valuable asset. And once lost, trust is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. After confirmation by a substantial bipartisan majority, I was sworn in as SEC chair in a ceremony attended by family, colleagues, and many who had been part of my journey from whistleblower to regulatory leader. My brother David, who had become a respected voice in financial reform through his own parallel career path, stood proudly with our parents as I took the oath of office. "I never doubted you'd land on your feet after Elysium," he told me at the reception afterward, "but I never imagined this. You've turned a moment of injustice into a movement for reform that will benefit countless people who will never even know your name." That evening, alone in my new office with its sweeping view of the Capitol, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events that had led to this moment. The termination that had seemed catastrophic had actually been the catalyst for something far more meaningful than the career it had interrupted. On my desk sat a small wooden box containing the fountain pen Richard Elysium had given me years earlier, inscribed with his mantra, "Numbers don't lie. People do. Your job is to make sure our numbers tell the truth." That principle had guided me from my first days as a junior analyst through the darkest moments of whistleblowing, the challenges of building the financial forensics unit, the complexities of the titanium case, and now to leadership of the SEC itself. The path had never been easy or straightforward. Each step had required courage, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to financial integrity. But the culmination was a position where I could help ensure that future whistleblowers wouldn't face the same isolation and risk I had experienced, and where the systems themselves would better reinforce truth-telling rather than requiring extraordinary individual sacrifice to maintain it. As I prepared to leave for the day, my phone lit up with a news alert. Former Titanium CEO Maxwell denied appeal, will serve full sentence. A small but significant reminder that accountability was possible even at the highest levels of financial power. I placed the wooden box with Richard's pen in my briefcase, a touchstone connecting where I'd started to where I now stood. Tomorrow would bring the first full day in my new role, with all its challenges and opportunities. The financial system remained imperfect, with powerful interests continuously seeking advantages through complexity and obscurity. But the balance had shifted meaningfully toward transparency and accountability. My journey from fired whistleblower to SEC chair wasn't just a personal vindication. It represented something more universal and important, the possibility that systems could be changed from within, that individual integrity could catalyze institutional transformation, and that apparent endings could become powerful beginnings when guided by unwavering commitment to truth. "Numbers don't lie," I whispered to myself as I switched off the office lights, "and neither will we." The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to ensure that financial markets served their essential purpose, not as arenas for deception and exploitation, but as mechanisms for efficiently allocating capital to its most productive and beneficial uses. That vision, born in the painful moment of my termination from Elysium, would now guide my leadership of the nation's primary financial regulatory agency. Sometimes the most significant contributions emerge from our most painful setbacks. Sometimes being fired for doing the right thing becomes the first step toward ensuring that the right thing becomes standard practice. And sometimes 5 million in accounting irregularities leads to reforms that protect trillions in market value. The journey continues. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.